Sweet in the morning, oh Lord, it's sweet in the morning. Sweet in the morning, sweet in the morning.
This is an interview with Reverend Lamar Weaver for the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute's Oral History Project by Dr. Horace Huntley at Miles College. Today is March 16, 1995. And Reverend Weaver, I want to thank you for driving all the way from Atlanta this morning to come and sit and talk with us about your experiences here in Birmingham.
I'm happy to be here.
And thank you again. I'd just like to start, just get a little background. Where were you originally from, your birthplace?
I was born in Cassville, Georgia. That's in Bartow County, Cartersville area, just above Atlanta, in January 11, 1928. My mother and father were on a visit to an uncle of mine in Cassville, and I was born there at home. And then we traveled back to a place where my father was working in Holly Pond, Alabama. He was a sharecropper there and worked in a sawmill. Oh. My mother and father had lived in Holly Pond, Colma, and Arab. That's where my father was from. My mother was from Georgia, was from Cassville, Georgia.
How old were you when you came to Birmingham?
I think the first time that I came to Birmingham was I was 8 or 9 months old. It was in 1928. I remember that my mother and father weren't getting along too well. And as I grew up in my tender years, they split, I think, about when I was about 6 years old. Because I remember my mother enrolled me in Henley Elementary School down on, I think, 17th Street.
Right.
Across from Kelly Ingram Park, and there I spent several years in school at Henley.
Yeah, 6th Avenue and 17th Street.
Right, right.
So your mother and father had separated by then?
And divorced.
And divorced.
Yes.
What kind of work did your mother do?
My mother was a nurse, but she wasn't a licensed nurse. She was going to the Old Hillman Hospital and taking a course about that time to become a nurse, which she later did. But it took her several years. And in the meantime, I just went to school and roamed the streets and played in the in that 8th Avenue, 7th Avenue, 16th Street, 17th Street area. Used to walk back and forth to the old boys club, which is up 26th Street. And ran with a real bad crowd. Back in those days, we had gangs and had gang fights and didn't have any guns, but mostly bricks. We called them brickbats.
Brickbats. Tell me a little about the education of your mother. Was she a high school graduate?
She attended high school in Georgia, in Cartersville, Georgia.
And then she eventually then would become a nurse.
Yes.
After running here in Birmingham.
Yes.
The community that you lived in was really on the edge of downtown. Then,
right.
How would you describe that community?
Well, it was a poor neighborhood. There was a Jewish school nearby, Henley. It was a mixed neighborhood.
How do you mean mixed?
Well, it was everybody was poor, but it was some blacks, Italians, some Jewish children. It was just a mixture of all kinds. But like I said, they were all poor, because we pretty well ran together.
Did you live on the same streets? Was there a street that blacks lived on, or were the homes intermixed?
We weren't separated by many blocks, maybe a block. I was very close to the 16th Street Baptist Church. That was a kind of a landmark back in those days of the black community. And I remember that one of my very best friends was a black boy. His name was David. And David and I used to go down to to a grocery store at 8th Avenue and 17th Street. And sometimes we would, if they had the fruit out in the front, we'd grab a banana or two and run with it. And David, at some point in time in those early days, got killed. He got run over by a trolley car. And I remember the man had just caught us stealing some fruit the day before and gave us a pretty good beating. And David got killed, and they had him laid out at one of the black funeral homes. They were like in a cluster right there around that area. And I went to the layout, and I went back by the grocery store and took a brick and threw it through the plate glass window. I said, David, this is for you.
Tell me, when I grew up in the western section of Birmingham, and there were whites, Italians, and blacks, and prior to going to elementary school, we all played together and were best friends and all. But once we went to school, we each went to our different schools, which affected our relationship because then we didn't have that same kind of opportunity to get together. Did you have the same kind of experience?
Yes, I've always found in life that young children, especially the elementary children, they enjoy the mixing of the races, and they get along fine. They have friends in every area. But as they go older, I think a lot of what they get at home from their parents rubs off on them, and they go their own respective ways. My mother didn't have that much time to. My mother taught me to be colorblind, and she never did try to restrict me from running around with any particular person. And I guess that's why, not to say that we weren't prejudiced. I think most people are born with a little prejudice, and as they get older, they become more prejudiced. But my mother taught me to be colorblind.
Yeah, you raised the issue of colorblind. Explain that. What do you mean by colorblind?
Well, she said there was no difference in a black and a white, an Italian and a Jew. They were all the same, created by the same master planner. And that beneath that skin, everything was the same. The pigment of the skin might be different, but the inside was the same, and that every person was different. And I found that to be true.
Did you get the impression that the same things was being taught in other white homes at the time, or were there differences in your home and other homes?
Oh, there was a great deal of difference. I was even asked by some of my white friends and some of their parents, their mother. One woman asked me one time why I ran around with this black boy, that I should stay with my own kind, I think.
So you were really probably the exception rather than the rule at the time, it appears.
I think so.
Okay. Yeah, I've asked this question a number of times to a number of people that I've interviewed, but what was your community's relationship to the Birmingham Police Department?
Well, I was never, that I can remember, arrested. I think at one point in time in my young life, I might have been arrested as an ambulance driver in some feud I was having about whether I could drive an ambulance or not. But I never really had any trouble with the police. I guess it's because I had long legs and we were able to outrun them. But the community and the police seemed to always be down in the community looking for people and for something to take you in for. And they were always chasing us. I can remember that.
So you were with a group of juveniles who were rather active, juvenile delinquents.
Yes.
Who were rather active in the community and always into something.
Right. We didn't mean any harm, but we didn't have any money, and what we got by picking up bottles and doing odd jobs and just making it the best way we could on the streets.
Now, was this a white gang As
This
you
was a
refer
mixed
to
gang.
a mixed gang
Mixed
in
gang.
Birmingham in the 1940s.
In
50s?
the 30s and the early 40s.
That's interesting. Were there in your growing up, and of course, as I said, you were on the sort of periphery of the downtown community, so I think it's probably a rather unique community. Were there community organizations after you grew up? You know, well, obviously during your teenage years, there probably were just those that you and your well, I hesitate to say gang members, but for lack of a better term, gang members developed.
Well,
But were there community organizations that your mother could participate in, and other grown-ups of the community? Were there any mixing of the grown-ups?
well, I can remember that I went to school. Of course, I went to Henley, and then I went to Endesley High School and Phillips High School because we moved a lot. I was on the south side, the north side, the east side, the west side, Endesley, and even Fairfield at one point in time. As far as the organizations, as I became older, we graduated from the close-knit in that area where we lived on 17th Street, 18th Street, 19th Street North, downtown. We could easily walk to the Boys Club, and the Boys Club was available up on 26th Street, and we'd go there because they had swimming facilities, they had basketball facilities, and we could get into a lot of things, and we did this, if you mean.
Now, you lived on the periphery of Kelly Ingram Park.
Yes.
Can you tell me anything about Kelly Ingram, how it changes over time? Because
Kelly Ingram was a playground for Henley School, and it was also an area for people to hang out. We had our playground, and I remember we had a wrestling area where we'd go over and wrestle and just play in general in Kelly Ingram Park. It was just a hangout. But as I got older, it was easy to walk up to the Boys Club because we had all the facilities that we didn't have at Kelly Ingram Park. But Kelly Ingram Park was a notorious hangout area, play area for gangs, and there were a lot of fights out there on Kelly Ingram Park with different gangs. We'd come a lot of times with sacks full of bricks, and wait till the other gang got there, and then we'd start throwing those rocks.
at that point, I guess we're talking about the 30s and 40s.
Yes.
Was the periphery of Kelly Ingram, were those homes right around Kelly Ingram, were they black or white?
Well, they were black and white. That was mostly the 16th Street Baptist Church was kind of the landmark of the black community. And then there was I believe, an Italian grocery where the Civil Rights Museum is today. And then, of course, there was A.G. Gaston Funeral Home, which was on the other corner, and that was the center of the black community. But then you turned and went up to the Mecca Hotel, and you gradually got away into the downtown area. But the black community came up to that line because of the Masonic Temple building and the other buildings where blacks had offices.
Someone suggested that Kelly Ingram was really a white park, and blacks were not allowed in the park.
There were a lot of gang fights over that, and some of us who were in a mixed gang fought the other gangs for the turf, so to speak, because blacks at that point in time, especially in the 30s, were not welcome in Kelly Ingram Park. It kind of changed in the 40s because of the neighborhood.
Was the neighborhood changing
Yes.
at that time?
Yes.
Okay. So you were getting more blacks into the area, so therefore Kelly Ingram would become more accessible than to blacks.
I would think so, yes.
In 1954, when the Brown versus Board of Education decision was made, Supreme Court, what were you doing at that time?
I was working at TCI, Also had a part-time job driving an ambulance, and was also still going in and out occasionally at Southeastern Bible College.
So you attended Southeastern Bible College
All
after
during,
you...
from the early 50s, I was at Southeastern Bible College. The Lord had saved me in '49, and I was a Christian then. And of course, everything changed for me. My life changed, and I was really seeking to make money to pay the bills and do what I could on at Southeastern, because I felt that the Lord had called me to be involved in the civil rights movement. And I had become, I was asked to come to A.G. Gaston Funeral Home and speak to their group of employees as a young minister and student, and I went there and got to know a lot of the blacks, and it just became a challenge to do more.
Tell me a little about, before we get into the civil rights era, tell me a little about after you finished high school, and did you go right into Bible college at that time, or did you find a job?
Well, I did both, really.
Okay.
I did both.
Okay.
Did both.
And what year did you finish Phillips High School?
No, I didn't finish Phillips. I went over to back to Cassville to finish my last year. I went over there for 6 or 7 months and finished high school.
Why
over
did
there.
you go back to Cassville?
Well, my mother was having trouble then with her studies to become a nurse over at the old Hillman Hospital. And I would make frequent trips back to Cassville to an uncle's farm. During the summer, a lot of times I would go over there and work. And I joined a church over there. And I decided to go back to Cassville and pick up what I needed to finish. And I did.
Okay, so what did you do then right after finishing at Cassville?
I came back to Birmingham. I'd really never left it. It was just a short bus trip from Cassville to Rome, Rome to Gadsden, Gadsden to Birmingham. I came back and just picked up my activities.
And those activities included what?
Part-time ambulance driver, working at the TCI.
How did you initially get the job at TCI? What was your job at TCI?
I was in the metallurgist department out there.
How did you get that job?
Tell you the truth, I don't remember. I think I just went out there and they needed somebody and they hired me.
Okay. And how long were you there?
I want to say a year, but it could have been less.
So
I left there abruptly.
why? Any particular reasons?
Well, when I'd become involved in the civil rights movement, I also become involved in politics, and I had run for city office, and I had gone with 2 ministers from Southeastern Bible College and registering people to vote in several states, and Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, who I had got to know, had told me that he was going to sit in the white waiting room at the terminal station, the Union terminal station, and I told him I would come and join him. But whites could not sit with blacks, and blacks could not sit with whites. I did not know that Fred had notified the media, and he really garnered a crowd. And when I got there, I had to park a block away, and I went in and sat with him, and of course, he had sense enough to get a ticket, and I didn't. I didn't think about buying a ticket. I didn't think I'd need one. I was going to stay there as my home. But the mob gathered, and the police came in and wanted to know if they had tickets, and he and Ruby, his wife, did. I had no ticket, so they escorted me to the door. And several persons heard the remark that, well, what are you going to do with him? Said, we're going to turn him loose out to those people out there, and they did. They put me right out the front door. A guy grabbed me just as soon as we got out with a suitcase and hit me and knocked me to the floor. to the ground and kicked me a couple of times. But ABC was there taking pictures.
What's AB? Oh, the
And,
network.
Yes. So I think it saved my life because they don't like to have, the Klan then never did like to have their pictures taken. So I got up and walked to my car a block away slowly because I knew to run would be a disaster. But scared to death, got in my car, and as I got in my car and got the key in the ignition, there was construction going on right there, and they picked up cement blocks and started knocking the top in and busting the glass, and then trying to rock and turn my car over. There was about a dozen got on each side, and they were rocking my car, but I managed to get it started and leave the area where I went straight to the city hall where I was arrested and given a speedy trial because they wanted me to leave town for my own safety. And
There was a report that in your escaping the crowd that you actually ran over someone.
someone said I did, that I actually hit him. Actually, I think I just pushed him out of the way with my fender. There was no real injury. But I ran a red light, and that was the thing. To get away from them, I had to run the red light.
And you were arrested.
For running a red light, fleeing a mob. And that
Was that
necessitated me to immediately resign at the TCI and go out and get my last check, which a black funeral director, Ernest Poole, John Poole, took me, hid my car and hid me, and they took me out to get my last check, and there was a mob out there at TCI, people hollering at me and calling me names, but I got my last check and left the TCI that day.
Why did you think it was necessary for you to leave TCI?
I was told to resign, that they didn't want me out there anymore.
Now this is in '57.
57.
Fred Shuttlesworth starts the Alabama Christian Movement for Human Rights in 1956.
Right.
Were you involved in that?
I was told I was an early member of SCLC, and I attended a lot of the Monday night meetings. But I met Fred either in '53 or '54 when I met Fred. I also that year met Dr. King when he came to Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery. And I had gone down in '52 and spent a day and a half with Vernon Johns, who was the pastor at that particular time. And I have to say, looking back over the years, that my motivation came more from those two men, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth and Reverend Vernon Johns, and of course Dr. King had a part in it. Vernon Johns was the one who wanted to start boycotting the buses, which later Dr. King did. And Vernon Johns felt that blacks should establish businesses so that all the money wouldn't be going to white folk and white businesses. And he was right. And he even started a fruit stand down there in front of his church.
Why did you initially go down to visit with Vernon Johns?
Because of the publicity he was getting. I'd heard about him. And then I met Fred because of the same thing. Went over to Bethel Baptist Church one day and met a young minister full of vigor who, and I said, we're trying to talk to black churches and black people about registering to vote and counsel with them from Southeastern. And he said, well, let me show you a list. And he took me in the front of the church and showed me this long list of people that had registered to vote and become. He said, I tell my folk that they're not first-class citizens until they register to vote, become voters.
Did you get your initial impetus to get involved in the movement while you were at the Bible College when you and the other two gentlemen decided to help register people to vote?
I think my interest really started when I went over and spoke to A.G. Gaston's group at the Smith & Gaston Funeral Home, and got to know him and his wife and T.J. Gardner, his son-in-law, and their family and some of their people. And through them, I met Paul Welch, and some of the other business leaders in the black community. Virgil Harris, who later managed my campaign when I ran against Bull Connor. Virgil was a great man, and I had thought long and hard about the Civil Rights Institute and what you're doing, and frankly the reason I'm here today is because I want people to remember those people for what they did, because without them we would never have gotten as far as our goals are. And I always tell people to thank God for Bull Connor, because had he not turned the dogs loose and the fire hoses, and had he ignored us in those days, the movement never would have gone forward. And I like to pay tribute to those 4 young ladies who were in the 16th Street Baptist Church, because their sacrifice, they're saints now, but they could have been mothers and grandmothers and business professionals, but God chose to make angels out of them, and they made a tremendous sacrifice, because at that point the civil rights movement had come to a low walk, you might say, and that spurred things to really start happening. Right. Blacks got elected to public office. We got judges, and the civil rights movement really moved forward after that.
Yeah. Let me take you back just a bit, though, before we get to that point. Let me just ask you, well, firstly, the first issue that was developed by the Alabama Christian movement was the issue of the hiring of black policemen. Your campaign, around the same time, you were campaigning on the issue of hiring black policemen. Was there any connection?
Well, like I said, when the Lord saved me, my life changed. A lot of people say, Lamar, you made a Christian decision. Well, I wasn't thinking about the Christian decision. I was thinking about the right decision. And then when somebody suggested, well, you're getting around now, why don't you run for public office? So I decided to take Bull on, and in a race.
What year was that?
This, I believe, was in '55. Could have been '54, but I think it was in '55. And it could have run over into '56 because I ran twice.
Right.
I ran as a write-in candidate after I came in third in the first campaign. But my feeling was, in knowing people, such great civil rights leaders like Arthur Shores and Ozell Billingsley and Peter Hall and Emory Jackson, the fearless editor of the Birmingham World, that, the problems in Birmingham, it had been a segregated city for so long, and that there were no blacks on the police force or the fire department. And so right away, I was the only candidate out of 5 that said the headlines were, the only difference in this whole campaign is Weaver wants to hire blacks. So I'm proud of that, because I think I did make people think.
What was the response of the police and the firemen?
Well, I came up with Virgil Harris came up with an idea. He managed my campaign. He said, let's give the police and the firemen a raise. They're not making very much money. So I suggested that, and I was the only candidate that did. So they kind of forgave me. The white police and firemen forgave me for wanting to hire blacks, because every time I'd get out on the street, they would congratulate me and wish me luck. And I think a great deal of them supported me in the campaign.
You suggested that Virgil Harris managed your campaign?
Virgil Harris did manage my campaign.
This is a black man?
He put up a lot of money. We spent, in those days, $500 was a lot of money. But we got some TV time and some radio ads that I would have never gotten had Virgil not got in it and helped me financially. Virgil Harris was one of the greatest thinkers and one of the greatest brains that I ever knew. He actually came up he was the originator of the recycling program, to recycle bottles, to recycle glass, to recycle cans, to recycle paper. And he had a plan, and I adopted it from my campaign, that he would, that we were going to recycle everything and save the city tons of money, you know, and would have worked too. But Birmingham wasn't ready for that.
So you suggesting that Virgil Harris really is the initiator of what we term today as Earth Day?
I believe so. I really think so, yes.
What was the reaction of your mother to your involvement in the movement?
Well, my mother was a good Christian woman, and my mother, of course, did not advise me one way or the other. She was fearful of my activity because she had married a man who was in the Air Force, and they traveled around to different Air Forces. But they were here when Reverend Shuttlesworth and I were involved in the mob scene at the terminal station. And a great thing about my mother, and I'll tell you how great a Christian she was, I said, Mama, I said, now I'm going to tell them that I'm going north, but I'm really going south. And when the newspaper, and they contacted her, she said, well, tell you the truth, my son says he's going north, but he's really going south. And another thing about that, they were in Crestview, Florida, when just a little later after the terminal station episode, I was spending the night with them on Eglin Air Force Base in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. And the Klan had followed me. They knew I was going somewhere down there, but they didn't know where. They found my car, and in the middle of the night, my mother woke up screaming that the flames were attracting so much light out front. She said, the house on fire. Well, the house wasn't on fire, it was my car. The Klan burned my car in front of my mother's house.
On Eglin Air Force Base.
At Eglin Air Force.
You did take part in the mass meetings.
Yes, on Monday nights.
Alabama Christmas. Can you describe what one of those meetings would be like?
Well, as people who are here now in Birmingham, like Abraham Woods Jr., a great worker in the early days, will tell you all the churches would not open their doors to the movement. There were some black churches that closed their doors. Some black ministers forbid them to meet and would not cooperate in any way, but some did. And those few, I can remember Reverend Alford, who is now deceased, over in North Birmingham, opened the doors of his church. And there were several churches, I think 16th Street opened their doors. People would come, the church would always be packed, and there would be a lot of speakers. And Reverend Shuttlesworth was generally the leader of those meetings. And they would threaten, the Klan would threaten that they were going to have snipers out there to shoot as we come out of the door. And matter of fact, a man did take a shot at me at 29th Street North on the porch of a house over there. We dug the .22 out of the wall, but that wasn't coming out of the meeting. The meetings.
Did you find out who that person was?
No, I knew it was somebody next door, but we never knew who. Police wouldn't even come out there. Well, I think they came, but nothing happened. And the meetings, people, they would last late, 11, 12 o'clock sometime. And people were all fired up, you know. And about time to break, I remember Abraham Woods was called the lookout man. Now, I know you've heard the expression, the bag man. Please ask me about that of Bill Shortridge. But Woods would go out the back door and go around the front door and look out into the dark night to see if he could spot anything that was going on out there that might be dangerous for us to come out. And we were always afraid that they were going to shoot somebody or fire into the crowd as people came out of the churches. I did not stay for all of the meetings. I left in '57 and the meetings continued.
How many whites were involved in the meetings?
Well, to tell you the truth, up to 57, I never saw any white people there. There could have been some, but I never saw any. After 57, I can't speak for those who might have become involved or sympathetic later on. I know that there were a lot of people sympathetic to the meetings, but they didn't come out prior to 57.
There was mention of police who actually attended and recorded meetings. Do you remember that?
Well, I've been told that, and I'm sure it happened because of people have told me the same stories, that the meetings were recorded. But I actually never saw a white face in any of the congregations.
So you were the exception. Tell me about Mr. Shortridge.
Later in the movement, when people were becoming frequently arrested and they would need to be bailed out, Shortridge was called on to get the money together, and he was called a bag man. And his wife, I think, is on the Civil Rights Museum now. He was as white as I am. A lot of people couldn't believe he was black, but he was a great man and had a great sense of humor. And he would always go out and get the money and come down and put up the bail. We called him the bag man.
So that was, I talked with his wife, and she said that he was never arrested. And she said if he had been, they would not have been able to get the money because he was the man that handled
And
the
there'd have
money.
been a lot of them stayed in jail.
What church did you attend at that time?
Well, I attended the Norwood Baptist Church occasionally. I shifted around. I've never really attended a church on a regular basis. When I left Birmingham and went to Cincinnati, I joined the largest black church up there, Revelation Baptist Church, but I did not attend regularly. I still don't attend church regularly.
You joined Revelations Baptist Church
in Cincinnati, Ohio. Right.
This was a black church.
Yes, and my membership has been there since '57, still there.
Were there other white members?
No, I was the only white member there.
You sort of stood out in your career then.
Well, I just asked the Lord to tell me the right thing to do, and I tried to do it. I tried to be an example for my children and tried to be an example for my friends.
What did you do when you went to Cincinnati? Well, first of all, why did you leave Birmingham to go to Cincinnati?
Well, some of my friends told me after the episode at the terminal station that my days were numbered. And especially after it became known that I had been hiding out here and that I went to Washington. Senator Tom Hennings, who was a senator from Missouri, had asked me to come up prior to that and speak to the first committee talking about the first civil rights bill in Washington, a bill that later passed, I think in '60. It finally passed the Senate and the House. I went up there right after the episode at the terminal station and arrived amid bomb threat at the airport, leaving Birmingham. And in getting there, my congressman, who was George Huddleston at the time, made it a point to meet me in the hallway when I was going to give my testimony, and called me every name in the book, told me never to come back to Birmingham, and I was the most despised man in the South. Ebony even ran an article in June, I think, of 55, 56, or 57 that had already called me the most wanted man in the South.
So you're the first white man, Southern white man, to
testify before the Senate subcommittee
on the civil rights.
On the civil rights bill. I was the only one that showed up from the South. My statement that I gave them is a matter of record in the congressional record, and the man who helped me with my statement was Emory Jackson, who was the editor of the Birmingham World then, and Virgil Harris.
Virgil Harris keeps popping up. then your days then were numbered.
Numbered here, and I left. That's why I left Birmingham, and got on a train and rode it to the end of the line, and that was Cincinnati. That was the L&N, and their last stop, their end of the train was their route was Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was met there by Reverend George Sangster and Reverend Aaron Bland, who were ministers at Revelation Baptist. They had been alerted that I was coming, and they met me with open arms. I had my typewriter. I was writing some short stories for Ebony and for the New Amsterdam News, and I had my typewriter, one change of underwear, and no bag of no sack. That's all I had when I got there. I checked into the YMCA, stayed there 2 nights till Reverend Sangster took me into his home. Shortly after that, I got a job with a funeral home up there and worked for that funeral home for 5 years.
Well, speaking of funeral home, prior to leaving Birmingham, you in fact were somewhat of a fugitive, in the context of being searched for by a number of entities in the city.
The night after the episode at the terminal station, Ernest and John Poole hid me out in the Poole Brothers Funeral Home, and I actually got in a casket during my stay there.
Why did you get in a
Aubrey
casket?
Bushlawn, who has a Bushlawn Funeral Home now, was there at the time and could testify to that. But they hid me out, saved my life.
Did people come looking for you?
Came looking for me because they were told that I was there, but they couldn't find me because I actually got in a casket during my stay there, and they protected me, and I did not know it at the time, but I told them I was going to Washington, and even the person that we thought was telling people caused, I think, a bum scare to be out at the airport when I left on the plane.
So there was someone that was actually
Tipping them off.
Tipping them off as to your
My
location.
whereabouts, yeah.
So when you arrived in Cincinnati, what did you do? What kind of work did you do?
I went to work for a funeral home there, but the Revelation Baptist Church and the pastor George Sangster, who later dropped dead of a heart attack in the pulpit, and Reverend Aaron Bland, who was the assistant then. I just went up there and helped preach his funeral just 3 months ago. Aaron Bland died, and they gave me money, helped me financially to get on my feet, and I called around the different funeral homes and went to work for a white funeral home. And of course, at that point, my civil rights activities pretty well came to a halt, except a few articles I'd write. Occasionally, Ebony would buy something. My thing with Ebony, they wanted me to go throughout the states when we were registering people to vote and getting people to vote and question the registrars to see how many black voters were in different counties. And we did that, and that was a published masterpiece for years of actually, Lowndes County was notorious. Ozell Billingsley went down there on several civil rights cases, barely escaped with his life out of Lowndes County, Alabama.
Was this after you had gone to Cincinnati?
No.
That you were.
This was
prior to.
Prior to that, and during that, and after that he was involved here. He and Ozell Billingsley carried on the fight here.
You left Birmingham in 1957.
57.
Did you ever visit, return at any?
Maybe once or twice, but to come back and visit City Hall, and I didn't come back until 78. And then I came back, just after 78, I would come over often to visit.
Yeah. There was one thing I want to go take you back just a bit, because in addition to when you were running for office, in addition to running on the issue of hiring black policemen, you also ran on the issue of integration.
Well, I really didn't just get up and make that statement in front of the cameras. I didn't say that to black audiences, and I didn't say it to white audiences. My emphasis was more on let's hire blacks for the police force. Let's hire blacks for the fire department. Let's give them a piece of the action. Let's have a slow integration. Let's do it because the Supreme Court is going to eventually said that it had to be done, should be done. So let's, after 54, it was just a thing of how long is it going to be, and I said, let's do it, and let's show some good faith and do it gradually.
What was the reception?
Not good. Threats. I was surprised the Birmingham News published one of my letters about let's start now on a slow basis.
So in effect, you have always sort of stood out because of the positions that you've taken where race is concerned in Birmingham. You obviously were a unique white man in 1955-56, talking about a gradual approach toward integration, because in the main, that simply was not being done. 56, the NAACP is outlawed from operating in the state of Alabama. And here you, a young white man at the time, talking about the necessity to move forward in terms of integrating the society.
My very dear friend, who has gone on to her reward, Ruby Hurley, who was a champion with the NAACP. We used to talk quite a bit at Arthur Shore's office about that. And she and Fred Shuttlesworth, just 2 weeks ago when I was in his church in Cincinnati, Greater New Light, said, Lamar, you had a lot of courage. But back in those days, I didn't think about the courage.
What were you thinking about at that time?
I was thinking that it was the right thing to do. That it was the right thing to do. If you're a Christian, you believe that this is just a proving ground. And if you get as old as I am, you start thinking back your first Christmas, if you can remember back that far, and my mind comes and goes. I'll be honest with you, I don't remember everything, but I remember a little red wagon and some raisins and, a few tangerines and oranges and apples. And now, I know after health problems that my time is limited. It's a cycle. Mm-hmm. So as a Christian, we like to think that we have done the right thing. Whether it was a Christian decision, sometimes I don't know. But we like to think it was a right decision. I'd like my children to think it's a right decision. I'd like people just to think of me as a person who tried to do the right thing and make the right decision at the right time.
Did you ever have any relationship with W.C. Patton? Did you know W.C. Patton? He was involved with the NAACP, voting rights, and that may have been, well, I know it was prior to your leaving, but also he was active.
Was he in the funeral business too? Did he have a Patton funeral home?
I don't think so.
The name is very familiar, and I can't remember.
Right. Yeah, but he was very active with the NAACP.
Uh-huh.
And with
Ruby Hurley was my main person.
Okay. What impact do you think the Birmingham movement had upon this community and the nation?
Well, I've said all along, and I think in Birmingham is where it all started. In Birmingham is where it started. The most impressionable things that have happened in the civil rights movement, to my mind, and I don't want to sound morbid, but were the killing of the 4 children and the assassination of Dr. King. Those are the things that people stand out. But we all know that in Birmingham, the movement started, and especially around Bessemer and Brookwood and some of those mining shafts. The truth will never be known until the judgment day and all these holes and wells and shafts give up their dead, because a lot of people died in those early days. A lot of people disappeared, blacks, because of the segregation. And I think that Birmingham and the movement in Birmingham really started people thinking. I know that, and this can be found in some of the newspaper articles which I have and which I've submitted. Eleanor Roosevelt even said that the civil rights movement got a tremendous push by the efforts in Birmingham, especially with Fred Shuttlesworth, with the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church, with those early meetings, spread to Montgomery, and we think it did spread to Montgomery. And then, of course, Dr. King came along and came at the right time, the right place, and was a great man, and he's a saint now. Made his mark and led the demonstrations nationwide, the March on Washington. But in my heart, and in my autobiography, Bury My Heart in Birmingham, I'm going to talk a lot about the Birmingham movement and those who were involved and where credit should be given.
How far are you along with your autobiography?
I'm almost through with it. I wanted to share some with you today, but I didn't bring it. But I'm almost through. I'm taking some pictures. I want to have some pictures in there of, I can't take the picture of some of these people, but I can take a picture of their gravestone and tell about their sacrifices and what they did in the early movement. Viola Rizzo, the Lutheran minister, came down on the bus from the north, never to go back alive, who was beaten in Selma and who had to be taken to a Birmingham hospital where he died 4 days later. Right. The young man, Jimmy Johnson, who really stirred up the march in Selma because he was killed trying to help his mother in a mob attack. There are just a lot of people that we've got to remember, that should be remembered for their families, for their family trees, because somebody always wants to know why, how did it happen, where. So we got to make some statements.
We're looking with great anticipation at your autobiography, and what we're doing at the Civil Rights Movement, Civil Rights Institute, is simply attempting to gather the information for the real story of Birmingham, and of course you've played a tremendous role in that.
Well, let me just say this too, that when the thought came up and was promoted by Dr. Arrington to build the Civil Rights Museum, and I understand they spent $15 million.
About $10 million.
Yes. This was heard around the world. This was heard in Atlanta like a bombshell, in Cincinnati like a bombshell. These tour buses are converging on Birmingham, and they want to see this museum. And I think that this has done a tremendous amount of good. And the people behind this are to be commended. There have been little museums started here and there, but nothing of this magnitude.
Right.
And what you have here, and you're to be commended, and it's great. And it's a pleasure to even have a mention in the museum. If nothing else, Lamar Weaver was a worker.
That's for sure. That's an understatement. Let me just ask you one other question that relate to a person who was very instrumental in the development of the Birmingham movement, but also had to leave Birmingham, and that's Fred Shuttlesworth. And I hear that you were instrumental in his eventually coming to Cincinnati. Can you tell me a little about that?
Well, always let it be said that I'm privileged to stand in Fred Shuttlesworth's shadow. I could have been called in the early days as a follower of Fred, and I don't want to take anything away from anybody else who worked in the movement. But Fred Shuttlesworth is a great person, and as a member, when I left here and joined the Revelation Baptist Church in Cincinnati, our pastor dropped dead of a heart attack. And I recommended to the pulpit committee that they talk to Fred, and they asked Fred to come up there. Matter of fact, I even sent Fred some money to come. And he came, he spoke, and they fell in love with him. They called him on the spot. And he became pastor of Revelation Baptist Church, and I told him 2 weeks ago when I was at Greater New Light, he was my pastor for a while, because I was a member there. And Fred Shuttlesworth chose to take a dissatisfied division of the church and go to another site, and they built a beautiful new church. And he is still there, pastor of Greater New Light, and doing great work in Cincinnati, has done great work.
Okay, well, I want to thank you for taking your time and driving over from Atlanta this morning to come and sit and talk with us, to give us your perception of what took place in Birmingham, because that's a rather unique perspective that you have, being one of the few whites that were actively involved in the struggle. Again, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Sweet